Is there a double standard here? On the one hand, you've got Reform giving press conferences about the plight of women and girls. On the other, they'd seem to be in a bit of a tiz about whether they would send women and girls back to the countries that they were fleeing persecution from in the first place, including potentially striking deals with governments and organisations like the Taliban. Is this just a massive dose of hypocrisy? They care about some women and girls. They're willing to send other women and girls back to endure a barely imaginable fate. 0345 6060 973. Elsewhere today, a boost for Farage, who, as part of his plan yesterday, demanded that the Labour government scrap, or at least pull the UK out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which he said is a barrier, an obstacle to stopping the people coming here on small boats. A boost. He's been backed by two former Labour Home Secretaries. Jack Straw says that is a good idea. So too does Lord David Blunkett, former Home Secretary between 2001 and 2004, former Education Secretary, now a Labour peer, who I'm delighted to say joins me now. Lord Blunkett, great to have you with us here on LBC. Thank you for coming on. Why is the ECHR, as it's called, a problem? And what would you like to see your party in government do about it? Afternoon.
Well, it's not universally a problem. I ought to make it clear I haven't said anything today. I came on your programme, although my wife and I have got COVID.
I wish you better.
Just to try and clarify what I have said, which is that there is a problem. The problem is very specific. It's about the appeals process, which currently has 51,000 people who have gone through the initial process of assessment, been refused asylum and appealed, and have been held up in that appeals process for over a year. And that is totally unacceptable. And what I was talking about, and I haven't heard what Jack Straw said, so I can't speak for him, is that there are parts of the ECHR which I've used the term suspend earlier in the week.
Yes.
The technical term is derogate. And the reason it's a technical term is that it's been used for the last 50 years, including by previous governments and by governments across Europe for particular articles of the ECHR. So not pulling out of or suspending the ECHR full stop, but actually particular articles. For instance, Article 8, which is about the right to family life, where people have been able to string out their appeals on sometimes spurious grounds. Suspend that for a period, i.e. derogate for a period, and you can get this sorted. And that would be just one contribution, in addition to what the government are already doing, because they're doing a lot. But they're small announcements, unlike Farage's big announcement yesterday. He got what he wanted, Ben. He got the publicity, never mind the truth or the complications or the difficulties or whether he would ever be able to implement it. Whereas when you're in government, you have to come up with things that you know will work. And I think a combination of introducing digital ID, which I've long been in favour of, working with the French, because Keir Starmer's got a good relationship now with the President, Emmanuel Macron, to actually put in place a licensing programme that would stop the boats, because the biggest problem, of course, is you can't do anything until the boat's been launched and the smugglers are getting migrants on board. So trying to stop the boats in France by licensing them. So you couldn't purchase, you couldn't transport, you couldn't sell a boat without a license. Then the police and security services could intervene early. So there are ideas that I think we could add into the mix, including being quite robust about particular aspects of conventions which are no longer working. But it's very different to saying we're going to pull out. If we pulled out of the ECHR, we'd immediately scupper the Good Friday Agreement that was reached in 1998. We'd undermine all our relationships.
Which was Nigel Farage's proposal. It seems to me, Lord Blunkett, you're sort of somewhere between where Keir Starmer and the Labour government is and Nigel Farage. You don't want us to pull out completely, but you would like Keir Starmer to go further than he currently is on the ECHR, because the government is pouring cold water on the idea of any reform of the ECHR.
I would on derogation, which we have used. I used it when I was Secretary after the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. We have to be very careful about this, but the ECHR itself, the agreement, allows for that derogation, for pulling out for a period, for an agreed period.
Which makes sense. Why do you think the government is resistant to doing that?
I think that part of the difficulty over the last 12 months has been getting ducks in order. In other words, there's been really good announcements, things that in the long term might make a difference, like one in, one out with the French. We put a lot of money into France improving their border controls and setting up a border force of our own. But actually, they don't add up to a total pattern, a total picture. And because of the toxicity of this issue, not of migration as a whole, don't think people mind at all students coming to study full-time, paying their way and contributing in the local community, things of that sort, where we've got shortages and we need people for, say, a year's period. But I think that the boats has really caught people's imagination, as it did in a different sense 25 years ago. I inherited a situation where the similar numbers were coming in. They were coming in
lorries then, yeah.
Back of trucks and lorries, climbing into people's cars, even hanging under the Eurostar. We reached agreement with the French then with measures that did work. They worked for a decade until the smugglers came up with this new business model with the boats. Now we've got to go back and do the same thing all over again.
Do you think Keir Starmer is serious about this, Lord Blunkett? Former human rights lawyer. It strikes me as someone who instinctively does not get particularly exercised about issues like illegal migration. Do you think he is? Do you think he cares enough about this issue, and he has got the determination to stop it in the way that you are proposing he do?
Well, all the information I have is that he does care. He gets the politics of it. How could you not? You only have to travel.
But that doesn't mean that he feels it. That doesn't mean he's passionate. It doesn't mean he sits up at night thinking about how do I stop the boats.
I think he's been, at the moment, caught up with trying to deal with Donald Trump, trying to deal with international defence and security and trade policy. So he's had a bellyful, really, over the last few months of very major international issues. This domestic issue, because that's what it is, has to be now top of the agenda in the autumn, and I'm sure...
Why? Why does that... Well, you've got a cost of living crisis, you've got people who can't pay the bills, you've got an NHS that is on its knees, you've got schools with record class sizes, we're talking in the last hour about youth unemployment. Why does all of that pale in comparison to stopping the boats? Why should it be top of the priority list?
Well, it's politics. It's because every day, including now, you and I are talking about this. I used to smile nearly 25 years ago, and people used to say to me on interviews, "We don't talk enough about migration, do we?" I said, "We're talking about it. We talk about nothing else at the moment."
But just because we talk about it doesn't mean it is the most important thing. I would say that the government's top priority should be making people better off.
It doesn't. But if 70% of the population believe that it is the top priority, I'm afraid in a democracy, it has to be the top priority. In other words, you can't bury your head in the sand, Ben. You take where you are, you do something about it, you get a balanced, sensitive, sensible approach, and then other issues start to get into the public arena and start to care. I care deeply about the 900,000 plus who are not in employment, education or training between 16 and 24. It seems to me that along with this issue are the two big challenges of the months ahead.
Just a word finally, Lord Blunkett, on another element of the Farage plan, this sort of proposal of doing deals with countries even like Afghanistan and the Taliban in order to deport more people. Should Britain be striking returns agreements with the Taliban?
No, we shouldn't. We can't possibly. We fought the war to try and free women and children from the persecution, the oppression that is the hallmark of the Taliban. We certainly can't go back on that. We can extend the number of countries which we believe, there's over 20 on the list at the moment, we believe are safe, or at least a substantial part of the country is safe enough for people to be returned to. And we've got to be able to do that to demonstrate that we're tough in terms of protecting our borders. But there are lines to be drawn, and the difference between Nigel Farage and my party is that those lines stop when people are going to be put to death and torture.